to Spiritwind. As you remember, Spiritwind is a study group for spiritual adventurers, and we invite you to come along on the ride with us. We meet every Wednesday at 5:30 at Unity of Auburn to discuss different topics each month. And last month, our topic was the amazing Myrtle Fillmore. So let's discuss a little bit what we talked about last month with our resident host and author, Rick Reich. So Rick, can you tell us a little bit about what we talked about last month at Spiritwind?
Sure. We looked at an amazing woman who was Myrtle Fillmore. However, that wasn't her name originally.
Oh.
Her name was Mary Caroline Page. And she was born on August 6th in 1845. And interestingly enough, not only she was named Mary Caroline Page, but she was born in Pagetown, which was about 30 miles north of Columbus, Ohio. How she ended up with the name Myrtle was that was a nickname that her father gave to her, and when she got old enough, she decided she liked Myrtle better than Mary Caroline, and so that's what stuck. She was the 8th of 9 children.
Oh my goodness. So did she have particular religious upbringing at all then?
Yes. She actually, for the most part of her life, attended Methodist churches. Her parents were Methodists, and 2 of her siblings were Methodists, but her older sister and she never joined the church, even though they attended there, and it was their form of protest against the belief in hell. She ended up even saying, she said that she marveled that her wonderful mother, who loved so devotedly, could have worshipped a God who punished or took the lives of his children. So that's why she wouldn't join. She wouldn't join any church that believed in hell.
And this was even at a young age.
Yeah, at a young age, yeah.
She was thinking these things.
So anyway, she had tuberculosis from an early age, but we got to remember that things were different back in those days. They didn't know what we know now. And so she went to high school, and she finished high school during the Civil War, to give you an idea of when she was. At that point in 1867, she enrolled in Oberlin College, which was one of the few colleges that allowed women to go to college, and she got her teaching credentials there. And she was all planning to go to Clinton, Missouri to teach when her doctors forbade her to teach and told her that she needed to move somewhere where there was drier climate, which she ended up moving to Denison, Texas. Once she was there, she did some tutoring to make ends meet, and she joined the local literary society, kind of a book club. And when she went there, it was there she met her future husband, Charles Fillmore. Although they did take an immediate attraction, she had no idea of marriage on her mind. And so she was working. She worked for about 3 years. She moved back. She said bye to Charles and Denison and moved back to Clinton, Missouri at this point to teach. And I mean, just to show you what inflation is now, her wages were $35 a month as a teacher. Kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And then, of all things, just a few years later, in 1881, Charles kind of re-entered her life. And during that time when they were separated, they would exchange letters and essays they would write on religious topics and stuff. And anyway, she said she was a little more radical than he was. I mean, you can tell that was pretty radical in her day to be a Christian and say, I don't believe in hell. You know. And apparently she was that way on other things because she wrote this in one of her letters to Charles. She said, "You question my orthodoxy. Well, if I were called upon to write out my creed, it would be a rather strange mixture. I am decidedly eclectic in my theology." But that same year, they ended up being married in 1881, and the Fillmores at that point moved to Pueblo, Colorado. And he worked as a real estate agent and a sailor. And he was very visionary, must say, in his real estate work, and very visionary just from an economic point of view all around. Then they finally moved to Kansas City, Missouri. And that was in 1884. They ended up having 3 sons. Once they were settled into Kansas City, Charles opened a real estate office and was doing very well in his business. And then Myrtle's health worsened again. This time, not only was the tuberculosis flaring up in a bad way, but it was complicated because she had malaria too. Oh. And with the combination of the two, the doctor said that there just was nothing they could do for her. That, she better look at how much time she's got left. So she wasn't about to give up, and so Charles and her had heard about a guy named Dr. E.B. Weeks, who was doing a series of meetings, and they were on what was known as mind healing. I'll talk more about that a little later, but it was mind healing, and basically it had to do with a new kind of way of praying. Instead of regular petitionary prayers where, say, she could have said, "Oh God, please heal me of this malaria and tuberculosis." That would be a petitionary prayer, like almost as if you're begging God. And that's kind of weird because it's like begging God as if God wouldn't do it unless you beg God to do it. That has kind of a weird idea of God tied up in it. But anyway, he had this way of doing what he called affirmative prayer. And affirmative prayer is, instead of begging for something that hasn't happened, you thank God for what has already happened. And so she went to these meetings and she left with the affirmation in her mind, "I am a child of God, and therefore I do not inherit sickness." And she worked with this affirmation over and over every day, and then into the weeks every day, into the months every day. And in 2 years, took her 2 years, she ended up being healed. And she wrote an article in what became Unity magazine, and it was titled, "How I Found Health." And she believed she had really healed herself using that method of prayer. Anyway, Charles had studied all kinds of different philosophies and things. In fact, he had a little magazine at one point where he had articles on Hinduism and reincarnation and just all different religious things. But he he didn't set down in any one particular place, you know, and also he was more interested in business things. But in the meantime, Myrtle would have friends over and they would gather to have prayer meeting and just pray, all of them, and enter into the silence. And he began to study with Myrtle because he wanted what she had. And it was in 1891 at one of these prayer gatherings that they would have that all of a sudden the name Unity flashed into Charles' mind, and they decided to go with that. And originally, the reason why they used the name Unity, it was because they felt that their goal was ultimate unity with God, to be one with God. So, in 1893, the Fillmores attended a New Thought Congress of New Thought people in Chicago, and this eventually evolved into the International New Thought Alliance. And interestingly enough, Charles didn't want to be any part of it because he felt that they were different from those other groups and that they were Christian, and a lot of the other groups were not. Like, for instance, Church of Religious Science, you don't have to be a Christian to do that. It's a way of changing your way of thinking and stuff. But so he even made it sure it was clear that it was a Christian denomination by saying it was called, originally it was called the Society of Practical Christianity, and then the official name became the Unity School of Christianity.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about what that New Thought movement is?
Well, the New Thought movement was just, I think it was kind of an early recognition. They didn't have the evidence like we do today, but an early recognition that there was a connection between the mind and the body. You know, I'm sure that people could figure out if people that were, say, in turmoil all the time might end up with,
Disease or
well, like stomach ulcers or migraine headaches and different things like this, that there is a relationship between the mind and the body. And they were thinking, well, if the mind affects the body in negative ways, why can't it affect the body in positive ways, like healing ways rather than the other? And so it was a New Thought movement. In fact, it was looking at things in this new kind of way, with that affirmative prayer and healing in these kind of ways.
And so you already told us that the affirmative prayer is different than the petitionary prayers where people are asking and asking instead of saying, thank you for my health.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
So anyway, just going on in the history of them. In 1906, Charles and Myrtle were finally ordained as ministers. They were really co-founders. A lot of times people, when they see a couple involved, they always kind of feel like it was really the man in charge and the woman just kind of was a helper, you know. But really, in this partnership, they were definitely co-founders. In 1920, they purchased land southeast of Kansas City, and over the years, it has grown to its present size, which is about 1,300 acres. And that's Unity Village, they call it. 4 years later, in 24, the Daily Word was born. It has a worldwide circulation of 1.4 million copies, printed in 12 languages, and it's mailed to over 160 countries.
And is there a prayer tower?
Yes,
At Unity?
in 1929, at Unity Village, they built this. It's called the Silent Unity Building, um, and that's where they have the prayer tower as well. It's a 24-hour prayer tower. It is open 24 hours, 365 days a year, and takes a person's prayer requests and prays over it. They pray over it for 20 days. They receive approximately 2 million prayer requests annually. And I'm going to just say this phone number so you know the prayer line if you want to call it for prayer. It's 1-800-669-7729.
Or 1-800-NOW-PRAY.
Yeah, that's 1-800-NOW-PRAY. Two years after they had the prayer tower and Silent Unity, Myrtle finally died, made her transition at the age of 86. And the interesting thing is that's 47 years after the doctor said there was no way she would live.
So that's an affirmative notice that maybe prayer in this case was really working for
That's
her,
right. That's
wasn't
right.
it?
Yeah.
Well, that's an amazing story of Myrtle Fillmore, and we learned a lot of other details and discussed a little bit more about Myrtle in our class in the month of August. And so now let's talk about what's coming up in the month of September.
Okay. What we're going to do in the month of September is we're going to look at the Sermon on the Mount as it is in the Gospel of Matthew, but we're going to look at it from a number of different perspectives. I have perspectives on Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, the New Thought movement, and traditional Christianity. So I think this is going to be a very unique experience to be able to look at something very familiar to many people, the Sermon on the Mount, especially the Beatitudes, and then see what do Hindus think about it, what do they have to say, what do Buddhists think about it, and so forth. I think it'll just be fascinating.
Well, that sounds like a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, well, today we're just going to get an introduction to that. So we'll just get a little bit to see the kind of thing we're going to look at. But let's begin.
Okay.
The Sermon on the Mount begins with what are called the Beatitudes. What Beatitudes are it's simply an old word for blessing. So, in fact, one of the books I will refer to later that is a commentary on the book on the Sermon on the Mount is called Thoughts from the Mountain of Blessing instead of Beatitudes. Here's an example of a Beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's, one of the first ones in Matthew. Now, and so in the class then what I would do is I would share what other faiths say about that same thing, And what's interesting is when we look at Luke he doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount, but Luke has his version of the Beatitudes. And they're not exactly the same, and the strange thing is that whereas it says in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus went up on a hill and said these teachings, in Luke's it says he went down with them and stood on a level place.
To be on their same level.
Right. Anyway, so that's what it says. But the interesting thing is people oftentimes have a problem with that first beatitude and say, blessed in the poor in spirit. what is that supposed to mean? I'm supposed to have not a very good spiritual life? It seems strange. But when you look at how Luke says it, Luke just says, blessed are the, he says, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God.
Oh, I think a lot of people go with that one,
Right,
don't
they go with it makes more sense.
Yeah.
Blessed are the poor.
Right.
But what's interesting, and I saw this in one of the Hindu commentaries. In one of the Hindu commentaries I looked at, and which we'll be looking at in the class, they said poor in spirit, they believed meant humble, to be humble.
Mm.
Like they're saying, blessed are the humble, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Okay.
So anyway, then we'll be looking at some of the ethical teachings of Jesus. You may remember in chapter 6, it has things like, you have heard it said of old. But then they'd say that if you murder, if you're angry, you've already committed murder in your heart.
Oh.
If you look at a woman with lust, you've already committed adultery in your heart. It says things like an eye for an eye, instead of eye for an eye, like it said in the Old Testament, he says, don't resist evil. And instead of hate your enemy, he says, love your enemy. So he has all these things that are juxtapositioned against each other to make an emphasis on what he's trying to teach. And so he would say, you have heard that it was said, one of these things, but I say unto you this.
Mm-hmm. And so then we're going to learn what the commentary is from these other religious perspectives.
And what they think.
And what they think.
Right.
Okay.
So since we're looking at it from various perspectives, I'm going to make one reference here is there's a book called The Good Heart, Buddhist Perspectives on the Teachings of Jesus. And it was actually written by the Dalai Lama. And he compares the central teachings of Buddhism, which are the Four Noble Truths, to the central teachings of Christianity and the Sermon on the Mount.
Oh.
So,
very relevant then.
Yeah, it's not as far out there as it might seem. Let's see. When we go on in chapter 6, an interesting thing we find about Islam. Now, what happens, and I know this from being a minister for years during the period of Lent, where people fast during that time, a symbolic fast remembering when Jesus was in the wilderness. That's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. They talk about giving alms, praying, and fasting. And in the same chapter in Matthew 6, Jesus talks about those very things. There's other examples, I could go on and on, but we're going to talk about St. Augustine, who was probably the first commentator on the Sermon on the Mount. We'll look at some Emmett Fox and another contemporary Christian commentator on his day.
Emmett Fox is more of the New Thought.
Right, he's more the New Thought
aspect. Okay.
And then we're going to look at Swami Prabhavananda, a Hindu Vedanta person.
Okay.
And we'll be looking, as I said, at the Dalai Lama's book, The Good Heart.
So basically, this is bringing all religions together.
Right.
And you have a word for that?
There's a term that people aren't familiar with. It's called deep ecumenism. And it comes from the idea that in the early 1900s, they had the ecumenical movement. And the ecumenical movement was all the different denominations were going to work together for the world in world mission. Well, deep ecumenism is the idea of going even deeper, and instead of having all Christians working together for the common good, those of every religion working together for the common good. And I think efforts like this class helps that, to see our similarities rather than our differences.
Perfect. So we are inviting everyone to come to the class on Wednesday evenings at 5:30 at Unity of Auburn. Just show up. You don't have to do anything. Come as you are. We'll have these discussions. Bring your questions with you. There's no cost for the class. It's just a very open way to have discussions on spiritual matters. So I invite all of you to come. And I want to thank Rick Reich very much for your talk today and for leading our Spiritwind group. I'm Pam Hart, and I'd like to say have a great day.